Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Commercial Real Estate Library. I'm Damon Tamanawala, Garrett McGillivray. And with us, we have George Przybylowski, who is the Vice President of Informa, the founder of the Real Estate Forum, and the honorary member of the NAIOP Community Service Award. There's a quote, actually, I think somebody used this to describe you, by Harry S. Truman, that was like, who's the 33rd president of the United States, that said, you can do anything as long as you don't care who gets the credit, something like that. And I think a lot of that can be said about your career. You've helped so many people and done so much. Thank you for being here.
Oh, pleasure, and thank you for having me. And you're so right about the quote, because I emphasized that during that NAIOP award discussion, actually, because that says it all. Yeah, right. If you have humility, it takes you a long way.
Yeah. Can you, so first, just to give a little context for people, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the real estate industry?
Right from the very beginning.
Right from the beginning.
All right. So I'm born and raised here in Toronto, lived here all my life. I've got Toronto tattooed all over my body, and believe that it truly is the most amazing city in the world.
Can we see that, George?
No. This is a family show. Oh. So my parents were survivors of the Second World War, whereby my mother had been taken by the Russians because she grew up in what's Belarus. And her family was taken up to Siberia. 1.5 million Poles went up into that area, and half of them died of a variety of diseases. She eventually got out of there. I'll leave the story as to how that all happened. But when Stalin did let them out, he had one proviso: they had to leave Russia, so they ended up in India, of all places, and grew up as a teenager in India during the war. My father, on the other hand, was from the other side of Poland, and he spent his time as an officer in a POW camp because his war ended within the first week that the battle broke out until they were freed. So they both, it was rather interesting, because when they were both offered opportunities of where to resettle, they were given 3 choices: Australia, Argentina, or Canada. And they both chose Canada, not knowing each other, and whatnot, just realizing that there was a very large Polish community in Toronto, and many people had said what a terrific country this was, and they ended up here in 1949, and the rest came along. So, I grew up with a family that was immigrant family starting from scratch, and we learned a lot of values as a result of that have been with me all my life. So for me, I think one of the things to point out about that and Canada is the fact that with a surname like Przybylowski, that has never ever been an issue for me to achieve whatever it was that I sought out to achieve. And so I think that's a great statement about the kind of country, the kind of society that we have, because there's so many people with so many other surnames from around the world, hundreds of languages that are represented here in this country that make up this society. And that's who we are. We are just a whole combination of people from around the world, and a microcosm of that. So it's kudos to the fact that never was a stumbling block for me. So I went to a private boys' school, and managed to be the social director on the student council. So because I was a fanatic about rock and roll and bands. From the minute I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, I was just sold. Yeah, like this was it. I just had to get into this. I got a newspaper route to be able to get a Gibson SG Special guitar, like many of the players had, and in various bands, and we really got into it. So I was booking bands, and one of the bands I booked was Lighthouse. And Lighthouse at the time, back in 1969-70, you could argue that next to maybe, obviously the Guess Who were number one in Canada, and behind them maybe April Wine, but they were a band that was a combination of Chicago and Blood, Sweat and Tears and ELO all combined, because there were 13 people in the band, 3 in a string section, 5 in a brass section, and 5 in a rhythm section. Big band, 13 people, 3 roadies and a manager. Why is that important? Because after booking them in the December 1969, it's the spring of 70, and I get a call from the manager saying, George, it's Grant Spence. What are you up to for the summer? And he didn't know, but I had a job, etc. But of course, I just held back and said, what do you got in mind? And he said, well, we're going to Expo 70 to Osaka, and we've got a tour with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet for 3 cities, Ottawa, Toronto, and Winnipeg. And we've got a lot of other concerts, and we're cutting some albums, and I need help. I need a gopher for the summer to look after a whole bunch of things. So would you be interested? Well, what am I going to say, right? I'm going to say, no, I want to work at McDonald's, and I can't pass up that opportunity. So needless to say, I said, oh yeah, sure. Now at that time, I'm 17. My birthday's in September. I'm 18. So 17, I come along. I go to Hazleton, Yorkville. It's the scene. That's where his office was, in an apartment at Hazleton and Schollard, across from the church that's on that corner still. And Grant said, okay, here's the thing. You're going to be handling all the money. You're going to be handling all the banking, all the checks for the guys. You're going to get the band out of the dressing room and get them up on stage. You're gonna handle the logistics with me for the tour, because I'm going to Osaka. But while I'm away, it's a whole raft of things that I'm going to leave with you to do and work on, etc. And by the way, do you know how to drive a Standard? Because he had a dark green Volkswagen station wagon. Right. I had no clue how to drive a Standard. But of course, my answer was, oh yeah, absolutely. So here I was working away with this car. And
you just learned it on the spot.
Yeah, like I just worked my guts out to try to figure out how to be able to do this, and so there was my summer working with this band, and anything that you've ever read or ever heard about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I can assure you is absolutely true. Oh my God. As a result of the fact that I was driving their car and I was only 17, I did nothing because I was scared stiff that God forbid anything would happen while I'm driving the car, and I'm driving at least 3 members of the band in that car going somewhere, up to Hidden Valley or up to some other concerts somewhere else or whatever, etc. And then I would collect the money at the end of the night. And what would the organizers do? Well, the organizers would keep the biggest bills possible, and I would have the shopping bag. They were paid between $2,000 and $2,500, depending on whether it was a weekend or a weekday night. Right. Mm-hmm. And so it'd be $2,000 worth of coins, because people were paying, $2, $2.50 or whatever to see this thing, right? A great big shopping bag. And no banks were open beyond, Friday. They were open a little bit later, but nothing on the weekend, etc. And guess when a lot of their concerts were? So I'd come home with a shopping bag full of money, and if I just might imitate my mother, who I love dearly and has been so responsible for so many things, I would walk into that house and she would go, George, what are we going to do? Somebody's going to come in and break in for this. Where do we put the money? Oh my God, what do we do with $2,000 right? In 1970?
Right.
Figure out how much that is, right? So under a mattress, you know, and downstairs, and like it was just an unbelievable situation. So it was an amazing thing, and as a result of Lighthouse and that job, I got to know the assistant general manager at the CNE because they did a show at the X. So what happens? Well, between the end of the summer of '70 and Christmas, I get this call from this assistant general manager who says, you know, do you want to be co-chair of? We're putting together a Youth in Canada committee because we want to involve ourselves more with youth. You know, there was this big thing at the time, right, where there was this massive schism between the establishment and those of us with long hair and into whatever it was we were into, right? Not everybody was, you know, as far as the hippies on Yorkville, you know, that were pretty interesting in their own right. But, you know, the point was that there was just this really strong attempt by the adult sector to try to connect with, communicate with, understand. It's like people today talking about millennials and trying to figure out what makes a millennial tick. Well, at that time, we were the millennials. You know, like how do we relate to these people? So I met the assistant general manager, and he said, so here's the deal. We have a building that we're going to tear down after this X. We want to turn this into a youth building. It was right across from the automotive building where the Enercare Center is now.
Yep.
So it was a 150,000 square foot older building that General Electric had used for many, 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 many years and then stopped using. So it was vacated. And he said there's a youth day, so there'll be a youth day concert at the band shell. So we need a program put together of bands and who they're going to be and so on. Anyway, so long and short of it was, this was my baptism in learning how to put together an exposition. We had a budget of $17,400. I had a committee to put together, and we had a kiddies day and we had a youth day, and we had to program special events around the X at that time, and we had a whole building to fill full of exhibits and make it viable and make it real.
Right.
And it was an absolutely amazing time. Our concert ended up having Kenny Rogers in the first edition. They'd never played Canada. 10 days after Youth Day, Rolling on the River, a new show that they were filming at CFTO was going to come on to Channel 9. So I convinced them to stay one night over at the Holiday Inn at Warden and 401 and said, if you stay over one night, because you guys are supposed to leave on September 1st, but if you leave on the 2nd, we'll make you the headliners of this concert, because you've never played Canada.
Right.
And what a great chance to, you know, get some exposure for this upcoming show. So we organized a softball game between Kenny Rogers and Lighthouse and City Council. We had a guy show up from Syracuse with bathtubs that you could race. So it was a bathtub with an engine on it on a board. So we had various of the fellas, you know, actually go out and do these races. The drummer, by the way, from Kenny Rogers won that race, and then there we were. There was a little payoff, and that was that when we organized the bandshell concerts, two things of note. One was we had Lighthouse there, we had Crowbar, we had Brownsville Station, Kenny Rogers, just 8, 9, 10 different acts. There was an election coming up in Ontario, and Bill Davis, before he changed his hairstyle and everything, and he had the jelly roll in front with the Brill cream and everything else, and he'd been Minister of Education, a lot of concern was, did the kids connect with him? So what do we do here? Well, it was Bill Davis that paid the bill for Lighthouse to go to Osaka in 1970. So somebody woke up and said, let's have Bill Davis present Lighthouse at this bandshell in front of 18,000 kids with a platinum album for One Fine Morning. And then put on a T-shirt for Lighthouse. We'll take a photograph and make 15,000 posters and splatter them all over the province to show that, yes, he does connect with kids.
He knows the kids, yeah.
Yes, he can connect with kids.
So-
You would not have believed the introduction that was made by, I cannot repeat it on air, how he was introduced by Skip Prokop to get him out there. And he wasn't booed. And the photo was taken, and it went around that election. So 71 was doing a building, learning how to put together an exposition, at the concerts and everything
you're
else.
18.
Yeah, and you're
And-
18 at this
Yeah,
point.
and at that point, and at that point, one of the exhibits that I had was from the provincial government.
Mm-hmm.
So I get a call after the X from a fellow from the provincial government saying, how'd you like to come to the province and get a summer job next year? We have a $1.1 million program called Experience 72, Experience 73.
Right.
And we need a coordinator for this thing. I was blown away and said, okay, I'm on. Okay, I'll be there. So in 72 and 73, I was in University of Toronto and taking poli-sci because I was a political freak and thought I was going to have a lifetime in politics of all things. And so this was a chance to work in the provincial government, et cetera. And we had these programs all over Ontario where kids were able to do playground programs, community programs. So it achieved two goals. These people who worked on it were university students who needed money for their tuition, and there was something for the younger kids to do during the summer that was a positive thing. So it really had an amazing goal at the end of the day. So 73 comes along, and it's I figured 2 years of that, and that would be it. And I got to know a fellow who was an executive assistant to a cabinet minister as a result of this activity. So he calls me up and he says, I know you're still in university, but there's 2 new ministries being formed that will open on February 1st, 1974. And I urge you to take a look at the Ministry of Housing and getting a job there. There's a recession coming. OPEC came along in 73.
Right.
The most hated man in the world was the oil minister of Saudi Arabia, Sheikh Yemeni, who had, ramped up, oil prices up to the sky. And so he said to me, get in there now because you don't know what's going to happen because it looks like we're going to head for a recession. He convinced me to do this and finish my degree part-time and if I can get the job. So I went in, had the interview, get this job. Next thing I know, I'm working now in the provincial government, and we have a program of $750 million over 3 years with the feds involved through CMHC, ourselves and the municipalities, to renew older housing stock before it reaches a condition of blight, and older neighborhoods before they become as well dilapidated. So the whole idea was an alternative to urban renewal. The whole principle where in the 60s in the States and Canada, there'd be an older area and you'd just go in and bulldoze the 50 acres and build new. And what happens to all those people? So this was a complete different turnaround. During that time, I also realized that the downtowns and main streets also needed something as well. There were on the perimeter of many municipalities, people were building shopping centers that were just vacuum cleaners and sucking the retail dollars out of the main streets and out of the downtowns. So, got involved and we created those programs, and I stumbled across a piece of legislation called Business Improvement Areas in the Municipal Act, Section 361. Discovered that this was a self-help process that could be used by any retail area to try to do something to, from a marketing perspective, from a facade and streetscape improvement perspective, et cetera. So there were 4 BIAs in 1976. So in 74, 75, 76, when we had all this money to get out there, I sat in one meeting and I said, look, there's only 15 of us. The money is, if they don't use it, we lose it. So the way it worked was there was so much money in a fiscal year. If it wasn't spent,
Right.
it was gone. It didn't move on. And so I basically said to them, why don't we bring the people to us instead of trying to go out to these individual councils and communities and meet with them? So why don't we organize an event, like a conference? And they all look around and say, you know what, that makes a lot of sense or whatever, but none of us have organized the conference. Is there anyone here who's organized the conference? Nobody had organized the conference. And then someone knew a little bit about some of the things I had done at the X and so on, a good buddy, and I'll never forget, I wanted to kick him in the shins. He said, hey, George knows how to organize it. George, it's your idea. Why don't you organize the conferences?
Right.
Okay, and let's do the conferences, but you take the lead. You know what? I was a sucker for it. And I said, okay, I'm in. Because I was the party animal in high school who had all the parties at my place. I was always the guy doing.
I can see that.
Do that. I had the biggest album collection, among my buddies, so who would be playing the records at the parties. Right. So I said, okay, I'm in. So next thing we knew, we put out these conferences, and I can tell you that by 1980, I'm kind of proud of the fact that these things actually worked. And to our complete chagrin, they always made money, which was an interesting story.
Bonus.
On how do you, they're not supposed to make money.
They were to spend this.
No,
this
there's a convoluted way as to what you have to do in order to keep that cash within the provincial government, because ministries don't have a bank account for incoming money. They only have accounts for outgoing money, And anyway, so the long and short of it was there were 300 BIAs by 1980 in Ontario. We started from 4, and we just got a lot of ramp up action from that, and many of them proved to be kind of successful, and some of them didn't, and whatnot. And so we have main streets that got revitalized, downtowns as well through our programs. Neighborhood improvement, home renewal. I just felt it was time to move on after 1980, 81, and within the ministry, and I couldn't get rid of the conference side of it. That was something that the minister really loved, because, to have 2,000 people and get exposure politically, that was a lot of political will that he wanted. So I had to continue organizing some conferences, but I got into something called the building industry strategy. And that allowed me to get to know and understand the building and construction industry very, very well as the development industry in addition to that. And so what happened was, from 80 right through till 85, when I left the ministry, I had this opportunity to learn about intensification, medium density, all the stakeholders that make up the industry, etc. I mean, what's ironic to me about today, and the fact that people are concerned about, what's going on in our cities with intensification and everything else, is that in 1982, when interest rates were 22.25 in the beginning of 82, what do you think we were trying to do with the industry? Were we encouraging them to build, 4-bedroom, two-car garage, single-family houses out in the suburbs that nobody was in their right mind was going to be able to buy? Or were we trying to get them to think outside the box and say, maybe we need to deal with this crazy affordability situation, because without a first-time buyer, you don't have a housing market. And let's get into high-density, medium-density development in the inner cities and so on, to be able to get those first-time buyers into the market. So shades of, deja vu when you hear today people talking about intensification and so on. Those were the things that we were involved in big time in 81, 82, 83, and the industry absolutely refused. They would sit at meeting after meeting and say to us, you guys don't understand what the consumer wants. Nobody's going to buy those condos and so on. That's not what they want. They want all brick, 2-story, 2-car garage, suburban location,
Mm-hmm.
4 bedrooms. That's what we know. And of course, it took some time for the market to get itself back into some sync after that 22 and a quarter, mortgage rate,
Yeah.
those were
in
some interesting
82.
days.
So after 85, once there was a change in government.
Sorry, George. So at this point, you're organizing events for building strategy? Is
Yeah.
that kind of...
So we're organizing events for conferences that are trying to focus on trying to sell, like we were able to successfully sell neighborhood improvement, home renewal, community renewal, Main Street revitalization, etc.
Right.
Trying to take the same approach and now move it forward and deal with intensification, medium density, and a lot of that type of approach.
Yeah.
Right? But do it in a non-regulatory fashion. There was no places to grow legislation or anything. This was simply trying to convince people of the reality. Look, in 1951, the population in Toronto was 714,000, and the average household size was 4.3. In 1981, the population was 589,000, and the average household size was 2.4. Does that sound like people that want 4-bedroom houses? Or more importantly, in the inner city, needed the houses in Forest Hill, Rosedale, and
Right,
places
yeah.
like that? Really? I mean, hello, is there anybody home? I mean, it just was so ridiculous. It was insane, So we were dealing with trying to use facts to convince people of what the reality was, And I know today that if we took that 10-volume intensification study, took white out and changed the date, it would still be as relevant as it was back then. The difference being today it's completely been bought into. Back then it didn't. So we tried conferences, right through till late 1986, and then just let the market, go wherever the market was going to go, and so be it. So, it was really an incredibly interesting time,
Mm-hmm.
I just one quick little aside. So oftentimes when we do our conferences, I get these comments about the fact that, you can't have me just speak for 15 minutes.
Right.
I need a longer time. These aren't just TED Talks and so on, So just a little point of fact to share with everybody. In 1984, I had the opportunity through something called a secondment.
Yep.
That's where you're loaned to the minister's office, and then your position where you came from is protected until you're ready to go back.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was in the minister's office, Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and that gave me an opportunity to go to a few cabinet meetings and sit on the sidelines, depending on what the issues were that were discussed. So you could go in for a certain item and then leave and so on. Bill Davis, as Premier, had one very, very strict rule among others. No item discussed at Cabinet could be dealt with longer than 15 minutes. Didn't matter how complicated it was. You had 15 minutes. He had his watch on in front of him, and I watched, and I'm telling you, if people today think, 15 minutes is tough, think about it if you were cabinet minister presenting a very complicated issue. Right? You got to work at it. So, in the period at the end of 85, I knew politics was not where I wanted to go, because that opportunity in the minister's office had shown me the fact that, in the politics was just a very, very interesting business that had two very, very different endpoints. One of which was the backstabbing beyond belief. There were probably more body bags that left the Parliament buildings and the buildings around them than leave a morgue at any day. Just eat their young. Oh yeah, just insane. And I said, is this what I really want to get into? Are you serious?
Right.
I feel for anybody who desires to get into politics because it's a very, very, very challenging situation, to put it mildly. So I knew that wasn't the case. So then I had to figure out what I was going to do. So from 86, 87, and into the beginning of 88, I just had a lot of work that came my way as a result of my connections within the government, dealing with designing new programs and various things that would be boring to talk about.
Right.
But along came in 1988 a fellow who had been the organizer of the exhibitions for the ICSC, and he came to me and he said, look, we're doing a trade show on design, construction, and renovation of buildings, and thought, we'd have you organize the programming part, that's the seminars, the non-exposition component of it. So it got me to work with him and got me to work on this event. We called it Construct Canada at the time. And then after that one opportunity, because unfortunately it was at the end of May, just before the G7 summit at the convention center, so there was nobody attending the show. So so at the end of that, he split off from his partner and came over to me and said, why don't we create a company that will focus on trade shows and conferences that are geared towards anything to do with the design, construction, renovation, management, investment, development, financing of any types of buildings except single-family housing. So we're talking all the major food groups, office, industrial, retail, multi-res, and so on. And I said, okay. After we thought it through, we opened the door in July of '88, and with the idea of doing our first shows in '89. And so we had a show on office and industrial real estate, where 200 exhibitors, because there was just this massive plethora of sites and buildings that were built totally on spec. Sitting there totally on spec. I remember one fellow who built a shopping center in Scarborough. He was so proud of the fact that he got his financing based on a 4-page letter of market analysis. By the way, today, if you drive and look at where that retail plaza was, it's all townhouses. Because it never should have been retail in the first place, right? But there was just all kinds of craziness going on, right? It was that era of that we like to think the U.S. experienced in 2005, 6, 7. Where guys were writing checks faster than
Can't lose.
Well,
exactly.
Then two things, because some lenders would say too, I don't want to lose my job, because if I don't give Garrett that money that he's asking for, then the next thing that's going to happen is Garrett's going to go across the street and get the money, and my boss is going to say, why didn't you do that loan?
Right.
And I might be out of a job. So we had our moments came earlier than the States. Normally we lagged the States in so many different things, but that time, So in 88, 89, and the money's just flowing like Niagara Falls. Real estate is just, going gangbusters. Condominiums went over $500 a square foot. They had a big party in Yorkville when the first condo hit $500 a square foot back then.
Yeah.
Okay, and so so we had a show on industrial and office. But then we had a show on condominiums right after that. And that was in May. And the first weekend of April, the Financial Post, which only came out on weekends, my good buddy Frank Clayton, who I've known for decades and loved dearly, was quoted saying, "Bottom falls out of condo market." And that was the beginning of the end. And all of a sudden, this show where we had all these exhibitors, the attendance went the other way.
Oh no!
Yeah. And so we had a terrible time with that show as a result. And then we had a show on the Office That Works, and then we had a show on construction at the end of the year. And there was a fellow who came along.
Who are the type of people at these shows, by the way, just for context?
So in the industrial and office show, it was developers galore of any type, and investors, and brokers and lenders. And the condominium show was a consumer show, so that was intended to be for people who were looking for condos. Didn't work.
Right. Any of the guys still in the game today that would have been on the developer side? We had. There were definitely a few. Orlando, for example, was one, but Morgard was there. But an awful lot, regrettably didn't make it out of the early 90s.
Well, when you're building shopping malls in the middle of nowhere.
Incredible. So we had, then we focused on, and for me it was what I knew, given the years that I'd spent in the provincial government. They were important to set up for me the thinking behind what we were going to do with this construction show, because that building industry strategy showed me all of the doorways to all of the major stakeholders and a more thorough understanding of what made the industry tick. I mean, when you think about the context of construction today, total construction, so that's infrastructure, residential, both repairs, renovation, etc., as well as new construction, and all non-residential. It represents somewhere between 11 and 12% of the GDP, and you're talking about $230 billion.
Right.
I mean, what people don't realize is just the scope, scale, and everything of that particular industry. Imagine Japan was the flavor of the month in that period in the early 80s. Everybody looked to Japan and said, boy, whatever they're doing, we should be doing more of, right? They're doing it right. They had a ministry of construction. It was huge. Our federal government, as I'm sitting here, had a Canadian Construction Research Board and had one staff person in the Ministry of Industry and Trade. That was it. They have a ministry over there on the other side of the Pacific. We have one fellow. Are you kidding me? So it was always going to be a tough time for the construction industry to get a lot of face time, with governments on things, because it was viewed more as a service that was a byproduct of something else. So agriculture, automotive, those were mining, those were clear-cut industries. That's the egg, right? Whereas construction was viewed like the chicken. Something else was the egg that resulted in the chicken. So that's what made it very difficult for the construction industry to ever lobby, the government, because they kind of yawned and didn't necessarily see it for what it really was.
And there's only one guy.
Oh yeah,
his schedule is pretty full.
That was it. So 1989
today. I don't know what to tell you.
So 1989's there, and we've got a fellow comes to see us and says, you know what? I've got all the property management magazines in Canada, and I've got a show that we've done this previous year, but I don't know anything about how to do a show. I know very much how to publish magazines, and therefore I know the advertisers, meaning potential exhibitors, and my readers are the potential attendees. What do you think we can come together and do this as a joint venture where you take on the things that I'm weak in and I'll deliver the things that I'm good in? So we took that show, and for 1 year it stood on its own. We had Construct Canada over here for architects, engineers, and contractors, and over here was a show for the building owners and property managers and building operators who had to deal with the buildings from Construct Canada for the next 50 years of the life cycle of those buildings. So it took 1 year for us to realize, we got to put these two together because they have synergies with each other. There's common exhibitors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that resulted in Construct Canada and PM Expo being together and being our main driving show through the 90s, and it even grew while we went through that very prolonged recession because of the fact that we had that property management component. Because you can't forget about the roof or the building envelope or the HVAC system or anything else while the building might be 20% empty. Right. If you want that asset to continue to remain an asset when the time comes, you've got to continue to. Yeah. So there was always a need to do something. So that was a smart move strategically that kept that show in the right path, growing.
By the way, what was the energy like back then in the early 1980s when, early 1990s when the bottom falls out a little bit and there is a recession? Like, what is the conference? What are people saying at the conference? Is there panic? Can you see what's going to happen before the crisis a little bit? To say there was concern is to put it mildly, because there were so many companies that, were here today, gone tomorrow. And that is it's a great segue into what happened to us at that point, because 92 was a game changer for us in our business. So we happily have that trade show. We have a few other shows which I won't bore you with that have nothing to do with construction, but which are there to just try and keep us alive with cash flow. Because in those days it was all about cash flow, just doing whatever you could to stay alive till 95. That was the mantra: stay alive till 95. Anyway, so I had a luncheon, and when we played taps for the show that we did on office and industrial real estate. After 91, it was as dead as a doorknob. There was, of course, no more need for it, because who was building spec what? Who had any financing, never mind anything else, right? And who was even standing, right? Like it was last man standing type of scenario with regards to companies disappearing and so on. So we have this little luncheon to thank people very much who had helped us through those 3 years. It was about a dozen people. We were in where the Harbor 60 Steakhouse is. That's where our area was. That was called the World Trade Center back then. Yeah. Huh. So we're sitting there, and somebody turned to me and said, George, the trade show might be dead, but you should keep the conference going. I said, what? He says, yeah. We had a conference component that was concurrent with the trade show, called it Urban Visions. And they said, no, you've got to keep the conference going. I said, wait a minute. I must be losing it here. There's this conference that's been around for 20 years that's owned by McLean Hunter. It's produced by the fellow who's the publisher of all of the real estate industry magazines. I know him well from my days of the ministry. We were in the same building at 777 Bay. And I said, how do we roll out a conference that's going to compete against the conference that everybody goes to? I mean, everybody who's anybody in the real estate industry talks about the Property Forum. Mm-hmm. So tell me how we can possibly exist while that's out there. Well, you know what? They gave me some incredible insights. They said, first of all, it's 1992, and the late registration fee for that event is $950. Wow. $950 in 1992. Think about what that would be today. And then the way the conference is structured and how it functions, because it's a publisher that's running this, he gives it's a bit of a pay to play. If you've got ads in his magazines, you're likely going to be 99% sure to be asked to speak. Mm-hmm. But by the way, how do you speak? Is it going to be a panel discussion and conversation and that kind of thing?
No, they have a 5-inch thick minimum, 5-inch thick binder that you get with registration. Oh, well, what do you have in the binder? Well, you have a copy of every speech that everybody's giving at the conference. Because what they wanted was they wanted you to get up as, okay, if you were recruited as a speaker, then you got up and you gave a speech, and you this speech was sent in ahead of time so that they could make multiple copies, 3-hole punch it, and put it into these binders. So people had a takeaway.
Interesting.
So dialogue was very minimal at that time. And they said, so if you could create something that would be an alternative to that, along the lines of what you had in Urban Visions. So what did we have in Urban Visions? Well, we always started with the premise that you first have to determine what are the right topics. If this is a conference on this, then what are the right topics for that conference? Mm-hmm. Secondly, who are the right speakers to discuss those topics? Thirdly, can they do that in some type of a dialogue where there's a back and forth? Maybe it's provocative, maybe it's, pros and cons or whatever, but, there aren't speeches per se. There's a panel discussion.
Right.
And fourth, it was always priced as low as possible. So I took that into account and said, you know what? That's going to be our value proposition. The right topics with the right speakers at the lowest possible price. And 27 years later, that continues to be our value proposition, because with the exception of the Toronto Real Estate Forum, because of its 2.5-day length, 19 out of our 20 conferences are under $500. Mm-hmm. In 2019, never mind the price in 1992.
$950 in 1992.
So we came out.
Now.
Yeah, and we came out of the door with our first conference. It was a 1-day conference. Bill Dimma from Royal LePage was the chair, because there were 2 people that I owe everything possible that I can say were critical and important to the success of those conferences, and they were Brad Henderson and John O'Brien. Because Brad sent me a note after lunch saying, if you need any help with anything pertaining to conference, let me know. Well, little did he know that I had no idea what an NER was. I had no idea what a cap rate was. I did not know anything about the topics that I was going to now be plowing into.
Right.
So I couldn't call them fast enough and say, how quickly can I come down to 33 Yonge and see you, And so they walked me through. They held my hand. They facilitated many planning meetings. Brad did an amazing job, and I never forget the incredible help that they gave me, because without it, couldn't have happened. So we had a 1-day event in 92. We had 311 people, and the early rate was $175, and then the late rate was $195. After that, the feedback was, my God, you got to turn this into a 2-day event. There's too much here to cover. So the next year, we turned it into a 2-day event, and we had 565 people. And all of a sudden, I could feel, looks like we're kind of moving in the right direction.
Right.
94, we added Ottawa and Vancouver, because people from those 2 markets said, hey, by the way, why don't you do something that's a deep drill on our respective markets only, because this event in Toronto is national,
right.
But let's just focus on that. So those were the next 2 to add, and then things carried on from there. So it all started as a result, it was connected to connected to connected. It's 6 degrees of separation, right? Mm-hmm. If it wasn't for the trade show in '89 on office and industrial real estate, and the conference that we added, we wouldn't have been there. If it wasn't for the building industry strategy, we wouldn't have known who to approach.
Right.
If it wasn't for the Youth in Canada building where the government had a booth,
right.
I wouldn't have had the connection to government. So you can see how all of this was interconnected. I hope
If
you
you
guys
weren't
don't
throwing-
mind that story.
If you weren't
Oh, it's a
throwing
great
parties
story.
back when you were in high school,
I know.
Yeah,
you
that's
wouldn't
right.
have been the guy at
That's
the
right.
band.
Or
all
on the
started-
social committee.
So,
Yeah.
so we could say it all started with that Gibson SG special.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah. And we've come a long way, and now look at the comfortability with the microphone.
Oh, totally. Well, because among other things, we had a 50s, 60s rock and roll band as a side hobby called the Haircuts. So for about 8
The
years,
Haircuts,
the Haircuts.
everybody.
So we did a
In iTunes
Frankie
now.
Valli set. We did a Beach Boys set. We had a Greaseball set. We had 5 different costume changes. Had 140 songs in our repertoire, and we had a ball. But then it got too much because it actually started to become a competitive job by 1985. So regrettably had to.
Do you have any old vinyl of some of your
Oh,
greatest hits?
tons. Oh, no,
Alright,
of
okay.
the hair-
Your greatest
No,
hits.
no, no,
of
no.
The haircuts. We
No,
want to
no,
see the haircuts.
we did nothing but covers.
Ah,
Everything was a cover. Yeah.
maybe 2020 you bring back the band.
Yeah. At the next conference.
Yeah, at the next conference, that could be the keynote.
We've canceled the speakers. Actually, we have a surprise for you.
No, the place would empty. No, I'd have to.
You lock the doors.
I want to rattle off some of these quick questions.
Sure thing.
So, one thing, can you speak a little bit to the transparency of the industry, actually? Because I was in here with a new friend of mine, Adrian Rakesh from the SUD Group, and he's talking about how commercial real estate is amazing, but that's the one thing that we lack is transparency, an ability to kind of hear what's going on in the boardrooms. And I feel like you're a big part of opening that up. Can you kind of speak to the importance of establishing a dialogue and like where the industry's going in that way?
Yeah, I think the industry's come a long way in regards to that. There are some caveats that people need to be cognizant of, because in an era of social media, it's very easy for somebody, when you're giving your remarks, to take a little sliver of what you say and accidentally then send that around. That happened to a couple of people who had a quote taken out of context by a reporter who was covering a session, and the next day, it appeared in the paper. So, that is something, but we do have a securitized real estate sector, among other things. And so the securitized real estate sector, the $80 billion worth of REITs, they have annual meetings. They have investor calls. There's a need for that transparency. The second part of that is the fact that in the era of the 90s, and I'll never forget this, in 1997, Doug McGregor was moderating a panel of the heads of 5 different brokerages, and they were talking about, well, what's your view of vacancy, and what's your view, and what's that based on, etc. And you might as well have been on the midway at the X with a crown and anchor wheel, just rolling it to say, well, okay, 6.5.
Yeah.
You know what? It's 7%.
Right.
And I'm making a little bit of fun of that, but the point being that as this industry has got itself into a situation where data, metrics, institutional investment, becoming a formal asset class now,
Yeah.
those have all been drivers to create the need for quality, accurate, and direct data and data points. And then if you move into the sustainability area and look at things like GRESB and ESG and various other things, that these have all been contributors to making sure that people are being fairly transparent. When it comes to so there's a difference between the transparency of what you're saying on a panel at a conference where you know what you'd like to be able to say,
Right.
but you have that little bit of a caution flag, because you don't know what might happen, as I mentioned,
Right.
But when it comes to the transparency of companies being able to talk about themselves, etc. The only companies who have a little bit of a struggle with that are more so privately owned companies, because they're very family business,
right?
And it's our business, and we have a strategy that we believe in, and we don't care to necessarily share that with anybody, because that's not who we are or what we need to do. But when you've got the pension fund platforms, or and you've got your investment management and private equity funds, where they have a very large amount of institutional investments, so they might as well be considered an institutional investor. And then you've your life cos, and now you've got your REITs and your REOCs. Right there, that whole panacea of companies, there's more quality data and more data, going around the block than you can shake a stick at.
So given obviously your depth of experience, and I cannot stress depth enough in terms of
you're being kind.
I'm being extremely kind, but you've basically been the man behind the curtain for so long in terms of organizing and promoting that transparency that Damon talked about previously. What do you think how do you think the current Canadian real estate marketplace is right now, and where do you think it might be going?
Well, I think the very first thing is that the massive game changer occurred as a result of the 2008-2009 crash in the States and in Europe, pigs and everything else, right? Because at that time, everybody and his aunt and uncle was looking around to try to ensure, is there toxicity everywhere, or is there somewhere where there is no toxicity? There was no liquidity in the first quarter of 2009 while that was going on. And then all of a sudden, what happened? People discovered Canada. And that, apparently one of our 5 banks had a little sliver, like a toothpick thick amount of, toxic investments, or
right.
so someone said. But that was it. Like, we're talking less than, 0.2%. Yeah, so it was really nothing. So we have to be thankful for what happened from 90 to 95. We have to be thankful that as a result of that, number of things happened. Institutional pension funds discovered real estate as a viable alternative to invest in, because what occurred through that period of between 90 and 95 was that the reluctant brides were the people holding the mortgages. Mm-hmm. And the people holding the mortgages would have been banks, would have been life cos, would have been some pension funds, etc. And then and so institutional investors looked around and said, "Geez, you know what? This is something that maybe we should have some type of allocation in." The second thing was that, and along came something called a chief risk officer. I never saw a title of chief risk officer in my speaker recruitment till the latter 90s. After the crash and burn of Confed Life and all those things.
Right.
So all of us. So in Canada, we were concerned about risk. Our institutional players were in. They had some exposure to real estate. They of course have totally different rules on this side of the border on how a pension fund can get involved in real estate versus how they can in the U.S. Big factor, weighing our way. And then the third thing was that when we got out of that mess, came the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions and a variety of other regulatory moves, so that when 2009 came along, guess what? Nobody on this side of the border, subprime mortgages of 140% on a single family house. Do you want to show me where that you could do that? Would that be permitted under any mortgage rules in Canada, et cetera, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we were well positioned to now be just like last man standing, where we didn't have the toxicity. So we had the highest GDP growth in the G7. Most importantly, we got able to take advantage of the low cost of capital. So when Carney's cutting in the UK and Bernanke's cutting away in the US down to zero to try to do whatever they can to deal with the tremendous issues that they've got, we were able to cut down, not necessarily have to go all that way, leave it at 50 basis points or whatever, but that low cost of capital era that started as a result of that period of time and now has continued.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at where, bond yields have gone in the past 4 months and look at this crazy trend of a long-term yield is lower than a short-term yield.
Right.
The bottom line is that the low cost of capital, I think, has been something that those that are really smart in real estate have been able to take advantage of, and others who maybe aren't as necessarily as lucky, fortunate, or talented could just sit on autopilot, press the button, and there you go.
Just go.
So after, from 2010 onwards, we were asked in our conferences, can we be sure that whoever the economists are that are speaking answer the question, when will interest rates rise again?
Mm-hmm.
And they finally gave up doing that. Because when will they rise again? Why? What says that what's past this prologue, that whatever happened in history has to absolutely repeat itself chapter and verse? How long can this carry on? Well, where's the preconditions? Where's our inflation rate? Where's our employment rate? Where's our wages? As Benjamin Tal points out, the highest number of jobs on a demographic basis created in Canada in the last 12 months was for the over 55 group. These are people who are looking to, we'll work 30 hours a week or 32 hours a week or whatever.
Right.
Not going to put pressure on wages and so on. So it's a tough call to figure out what exactly, how this situation can change, from what it is. So bottom line, low cost of capital has been a massive game changer, because that has meant not only the ability for where the spreads that you'd have to work with, but also the replacement costs.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
now what has that fueled? Development. Development in a way that we haven't seen since portions of the 60s or 70s or what have you, and right across the entire country. And in many cases, it isn't just development per se, it's also the renewal and the revitalization of cities, because when you didn't have development for a couple of decades in a Toronto, in a Montreal, etc. I'm referring to now major office projects, right? Between 91 and say Menke's Telus building, well, like where is the renewal of the city? Where are we in city building and dealing with uses that are need to be replaced? So I think that the major preconditions for us have been the low cost of capital, the sophistication of the real estate industry compared to what it was 30 years ago, the ability to be able to get into development in an extremely aggressive way, the creation of the multi-res sector in purpose-built rental. Again, because a lot of buildings weren't touched for a long time due to rent controls or other reasons or whatever. But now where you've got multi-res as a preferred option by some people, in order to occupy that type of unit rather than a condo or single family home or whatever. And then the final thing that I would mention is the changes that have occurred across the country. So, for example, our Montreal Real Estate Forum last week, we had an incredibly record crowd of 1,420 people. 2006 we were 912, and 2016, just 3 years before that, and so as John Love said at the end of the Vancouver Real Estate Forum, he views Canada now as MTV. So how is Montreal kind of snuck in there? Well, if Vancouver's fully priced, when you start looking at what some of the cap rates have been, 1.8 for an apartment building, 2.1 for an office building, you might say, well, between the land costs and everything else, I don't see all my opportunities being over there. There's no distress in Calgary, but there's maybe some people saying, you know what, I just have a little bit of a fear there. I'm not too keen or aggressive to get too involved there. Then you get to Toronto. Core here might be argued that it's fully priced. And who's going to sell core that's got it?
Yeah, nobody.
Yeah, and so
selling a building,
and then you turn around and you look at Montreal and you say, hey, wait a minute, second largest city in Canada. They've got 50,000 people a year coming into that market now. It's the only province with a balanced budget. That 3 years of soap opera of corruption commission is gone. Right. There's stability at the municipal level. Oh, and by the way, all those infrastructure projects they talked about for years and years and years that weren't happening are happening. And so they're ahead of the curve in terms of some of the infrastructure activity relative to other cities. And then when you add to that the 64 station REM project that the case is doing with the third fastest train in the world after Japan and France, well, what that's going to do to connecting the north to the island with the south, etc., that is just incredible. So now all of a sudden you've got another market that 3 or 4 years ago didn't have the same octane that it has now.
George, out of all the people that you've met over the years, of which are just hundreds and hundreds of key influencers, who are some of the interesting people that you can remember?
There isn't just simply one, because we have 1,200 speakers a year in our events, so you can add up and do the math of how many speakers we've had over 27 years of our various events. But a couple come to mind, a couple moments come to mind. There was this moment where Rex Murphy said to me, George, I don't want to give the speech that I've got in my pocket. Do you mind if I just go and say something else? And he got up on stage and gave this absolutely incredible speech, almost giving people in the audience a lecture and a kick in the butt of why can't you be proud to be a Canadian? Do you understand what it means to be a Canadian? Can you be proud to be a Canadian? Standing ovation that was incredible. We had an iMag on him, so we had it taped. There were 250 plus requests for a copy of that tape. The CBC would not permit it to be released because in order to loosen up the audience, he started with a few jokes, and in this social media age, they were concerned that things would get out of whack. But then the Deputy Minister of Education in the province of Alberta asked for a copy of that video, and so we got it edited out, and it went there, and it was shown in some of the classes in schools to be able to be a speech on why it's proud to be a Canadian. Chris Hadfield was incredible. You could see from every touch with this person why he was who he was and what it took to be an astronaut and to be the head of that particular voyage that he went on. This man was just beyond meticulous. He was dotting I's, crossing T's that you wouldn't believe. And he was just the nicest guy you could imagine. There was no ego there at all. Brian Mulrooney was fabulous. He came an hour earlier than he had to for his interview with Ben. I mean, we found out that Ben had never interviewed his father publicly. And we said, well, as soon as we found that out, we reached out to Ben first to make sure it was okay with Ben to do that. And then we reached out to the former prime minister through his law firm, and the two things came together. And make a long story short, he was so excited. He was so buzzed to be there. You know, it was absolutely amazing. And then I give you the opposite side of that. So we had Jean Chrétien speak about why free trade was not a good thing in 1988 in front of a group of people who were for free trade. Earlier that morning at another event, we had John Crispo speak about why free trade was a good thing, and both of them got standing ovations. Crispo for the quality of his speech, Chrétien because it felt like it was from the heart. All he had was a little 2x3 card on the lectern. There was no reading a speech. He was giving a speech. It was like the little guy from Shawinigan, right? Anyway, so so he was a paid speaker at the time. I had his check in my pocket, and I'm walking him to an elevator to take his car to the airport, and said, well, you know, Mr. Chrétien, you know, it was an amazing speech. It's too bad that, you know, somehow we didn't bring you together with John Crispo, who we had this morning, and who was renowned to Chrétien and everybody, because he was out there all the time, you know, and put the two of you together, etc. And I'll never forget, it's not on tape or anything else. There were no witnesses. The elevator doors closed. And he looked at me and he said, well, you know, it would have been just as easy for me to go the other way. Huh. And there we have it. Why do you have the image of politicians that we do?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay, well, that's amazing. I'm glad we...
True story.
Yeah.
Are we off?
No, one last thing.
One more. This is the final.
So this question is, it's called the three truths. Imagine, and it's not on here. Imagine, George, years from now, you live a long and wonderful life, and you actually live to be 150 years old, and modern medicine, and your kids and your grandkids and everyone's around you, and you had a wonderful life, but for whatever reason, it's your last day, and all of the content that you've put out, all of the best-selling books that you've written, everything, including this interview, for whatever reason, has been erased, and you have 3 short notes that you can write to pass along to your kids and your family and your friends and the people who love you. What would you put on those notes?
I think the first thing is that whatever you do, treat people the way that you would want to be treated. Live a life where you have total respect for everybody around you, even those who have different opinions. You know, find the good side of those individuals that, you know, irritate you or whatever, because there's something always there. And so, you know, be respectful. Secondly, in conjunction with that, remember that if you achieve success of any type, whatever that success might be, financial, you know, out in the market or whatever, etc., just keep in mind that you're only as good as your last slice of pizza. And so the key is have humility. And don't ever stop working hard, because it was that hard work that got you the success in the first place. And if you stop, you know what? It might be like a car without any gas. After a while, it's going to stop as well, you know?
Wow.
And the third, you know, the third and final thing is give back, you know? Because if you do have success, and you do achieve, you know, financial success or what have you, just remember that for every person who also has that, there are others that don't. And so a measure of a man is what you can give back to your community, what you can give back to those in need, more so than how much did that person, when they passed away, have in the bank account.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, George.
Thank you, George.